Welcome to MSL Talk with Tom Caravela, a podcast specifically designed for MSLs and all things field medical. Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Steve St. Ange, and he is Senior Director of Business Development at Paratech, and we discuss his transition from medical affairs to M&A business development, how he got there. Awesome story, really good information. I think you guys are going to love this. Don't forget to follow me on LinkedIn. Check us out on YouTube. All our videos go up on YouTube, and also visit us and join in on the discussion for our MSL Talk Live, which is the first Tuesday of every month at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Hey, Steve, welcome to the podcast, my friend. Thanks for joining me.
Tom, it's been awesome putting this together, and I'm looking really forward to it. And I thank you for the opportunity to come and have my voice heard to your entire audience today.
Yeah, man, I am excited. We've been trying to do this for a while, so this is great that we're finally getting together. I think it's an awesome idea, guys. Steve came up with this idea. I know Steve for a while, and we were kicking this idea around. I think it's a great one. I think it's somewhat unique. We haven't done this before, so I know you guys are going to enjoy it. So like normal, before we get into it, Steve, why don't you do a quick intro, tell everybody who you are, where you're from, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so Steve St. Ange, I am the Senior Director of Business Development and Corporate Communications at Paratech Pharmaceuticals. I'm a New York kid, grew up in upstate New York, spent the first part of my career there, moved to Florida in 2015, was there for about 4 years, and now I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. So it's been a fun journey seeing the East Coast, and my career progression has brought me along nicely as well as I've gone through that journey and moving up and down the East Coast.
Yeah, awesome. Well, we're going to get into that in a second. I knew you have a disclaimer. We had to get that out of the way. Let's get all the legal mumbo jumbo out of the way.
Yeah, so the many views that I will express today are purely my own and not a representation of my employer or any other arrangements that I have in place.
Yeah, man. Well, let's talk about your background, and if you want to tell everybody, go back and talk about how you got into industry. I think people love to hear that, and then I want to hear about your career transitions, because I think it's unique, and I think it's something that people are going to want to know about.
Yeah, so good question. My background is I was in clinical practice in academia for about 7 years, and I have to give credit to actually one of my closest friends who consistently motivated me that, look, you have the knowledge, you have the background, you have the tools to be really successful in industry. And so I thought about that for a long time while I was still in clinical practice. But my mindset was I wanted the transition to be as smooth as possible, Tom, and I wanted my skills to translate to that first opportunity, because I knew there would be some complexity and some issue leaving clinical practice, and
Sure.
I knew I was betting on myself. So I looked around for a while and finally found the right opportunity, and it was one where I was going to be supporting a portfolio of products that I was actually really familiar with from my days in clinical practice. I knew the reps from the company that called on me in the hospital. I knew the MSLs that called on me. So naturally, that was a really, if there is an easy transition from clinical practice from industry, I had that experience. And so I'll be forever grateful for the folks at the medicines company that took that shot on that, rather raw kid that had been in clinical practice and academia and brought him in for a baptism into medical affairs. My first 2 roles in medical affairs, were what I would consider traditional MSL roles. And so then, that after about those 2.5 years or so, I was fortunate to be hired as the first medical affairs person at Paratech, where I am currently. And so, for me, that changed the trajectory of my career a lot, I believe. Coming into a company that was still in its pre-commercial state, being at the ground level for the build out of a medical affairs team, and being involved in all of those very early activities. And over the course of those first 2 or 2.5 years at Paratech, I had the opportunity to do a lot of non-traditional MSL work. So, I was in a pre-commercial state. A lot of companies do offer that to their MSLs. I started getting involved with our clinical development and regulatory teams, working on life cycle management as well as our rare disease program, which we have brought forward. So that included doing really unique things to medical affairs, like helping draft FDA briefing packages, going to FDA type C meetings. And really, the output of that was I started to form a lot of really strong personal and working relationships across the organization, because I was touching, many of the different functions and working side by side with different SMEs outside of, the medical affairs, our typical lanes.
And how did that work? I know a lot of people that are listening that are currently MSLs or are in a capacity where they're looking to do more than just traditional, you said non-traditional MSL stuff. Like, how did that happen? Was it because of the relationships? Did you raise your hand? Was it right place, right time? Just curious.
I think it's a combination of all of those, but I think it was expressing my willingness to be more involved and being able to offer maybe tools or a viewpoint that others in that working team just didn't have that same expertise or background. So
Right.
really being able to offer some type of incremental value to that team while at the same time expressing, hey, this rare disease program is very interesting to me. I'm willing to commit 200% to my day job, but I'll tell you that the other, whatever I can give, I would love the opportunity to be part of that. And so that's what I did. So was it a lot of extra homework for me? Was it a lot of long hours?
Yeah.
Yeah, but for me, it was worth the return, because I got to see something, totally naive to me and, really unique to the MSL role.
Well, it's a great story. That's why we talk about how important it is to come out of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
And if you truly want to do other things and great things and advance your career, it's gonna mean raising your hand first and foremost. And second, you're gonna have to be uncomfortable a little bit. You have to learn. You have to put in extra hours.
Yeah, so then that transition, after about those 2.5 years of being in the field, being a part of the rare disease program, that transition looked like, what was next for me. And I'll have to tell you, I at times thought the grass was greener. And to take a line from my grandpa, when you think the grass is greener on the other side, you should probably water your own. And so, I started having some conversations within the organization about, what the future may bring for me. And, whether that was at Paratech or whether that was somewhere else.
Yep.
And, I think I quickly came to the realization that there was more opportunity for me within the company. And, I was fortunate to be approached by two members of the executive leadership team about leading the business development function. We had a senior vice president depart the organization, in early 2020. And, they approached me about taking on this responsibility. And for me, it was a little bit, I would say, uneasy, but as you mentioned, right, we have to get uncomfortable to grow personally, professionally. And, I made a lot of phone calls, to folks that I know that have done this in the past, that did industry fellowships focused on this, and said, hey, give me the puts and takes here, give me the upsides, give me the risks. And those conversations all encourage me to take this. Folks said this could be an opportunity of your lifetime, and an opportunity that very few folks get in their career, to step outside a comfort zone within an environment and a company that you know very well.
Yeah.
And you'll have the support there with those relationships you've already developed to be successful.
Yeah.
Whereas going to a totally naive working environment, imagine stepping into a new role that you're totally foreign to.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is, so you're in medical affairs, you're doing your thing, you start doing some non-traditional stuff, your people are taking notice, you're raising your hand, you're looking to do more. And then you had people come to you about this idea of going into business development.
That's right. Yeah.
And so now you're like, wow, okay, got a decision to make. So this is somewhat another non-traditional move. And I think a lot of people listening are going to be interested in this to say, okay, because people always ask me, Tom, what's after medical affairs? What's life like after medical affairs? Do I need to be an MSL for the rest of my life? What are the next steps? So this is something that is certainly an option. But why don't you tell us, what do you do in business development? What does that look like as far as what's involved in those job responsibilities in that function?
Yeah, so it's wearing a lot of hats, especially at a small company like Paratech. So, my remit to the organization is to bolster and build upon our commercial portfolio. We have two distinct sales forces. We have one in the hospital and one in primary care. So find additional products that we can place into that bag, and then also build out a pipeline. So that that is a lot of responsibility in itself. And then in addition to that, we're looking to out-license our franchise product to other regions around the world. Currently, we have a partnership for our franchise product in China, but we're actively looking to bring the product to other regions around the globe as well. So it's out-licensing that technology to folks that we think could be successful from a development and a commercial perspective in other areas around the globe. So a lot goes into those two things. I mean, it's really unique of the in licensing, bringing other products to the portfolio. It could be acquiring other companies that we think are very synergistic with not only our development expertise but our commercial expertise and our current commercial field force structure. And then at Paratech, business development also incorporates elements of corporate development as well. And so, I often get the question, well, what's the difference between business development and corporate development?
Right.
Corporate development is really all of those internal activities and processes that drive value for the organization. So it could be an organizational expansion. It could be an organizational restructuring. It could be a refinancing. It could be raising additional capital for commercial expansion or development projects. So those are some of the other activities that I get involved with on the corporate development side. And typically the smaller companies, the business development and corporate development blend together pretty closely.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually going to ask you that because I was curious myself. But as you're talking, where does this department, so business development usually sits within M&A. Does that sit, what department is that in? Is that like a commercial department?
Yeah, so I report to the president and chief commercial officer, but I'll tell you, Tom, it's a little bit different at every organization. So at some organizations, the M&A BD function will actually flow through the finance department. So those individuals will report up to the CFO, just because there is so much impact in these things that we're looking at on the P&L for the company and the go forward operating plan. Others it reports directly into the commercial department, and sometimes there is a branch of BD that comes out of the executive leadership team. So it really depends on where you are. But the one thing I will say is that in these roles, despite who you report to or where you sit in the organization, you're going to have touch points across every function. You're going to be working closely with those SMEs and their teams, because when you're evaluating an asset to bring in, either license it, co-promote it, or acquire it, there's a number of risk factors across all the functions. So I think, for me, when I first stepped into this role, that was one thing that it took me a bit of time to appreciate, right? In medical affairs, we're out there, we're, talking to the clinicians, we're promoting the science, we're talking about investigator-initiated research, collaborative efforts, all the things that go on behind the scenes to bring the product to patients, make sure it's available to providers, I always took for granted. So, there's whole aspects of the organization, whether it's CMC, technical operations, things that are really fundamental and foundational to the success of the organization, making sure that that product can get there, that I never had an appreciation for, but now I do, because there are so many things that can go wrong within those functions that would devastate an organization in how they operate. So when we're thinking about, again, acquiring and licensing or co-promoting assets, we have to look at it across the entire span. It's not just, does the science make sense and do we think there's commercial potential here? There's so many other factors to look at.
Yeah. And I imagine it's great exposure. Being in that role, you're exposed to so much within the organization. I would think from a career standpoint, you're positioning yourself for additional and future growth.
Yeah, I think I sometimes laugh. I tell folks, well, I know enough about now about all aspects of the company to be dangerous, but it really is true. I have an appreciation for what our manufacturing and tech ops team does, and what their struggles and the hurdles that they have to get through on a daily basis, and how that impacts the overall operation of a company. And my exposure to those have given me an appreciation for just how hard it is to run a publicly traded company,
Mm,
even a relatively small one like Paratech, where we only have 300 employees.
yep.
So having that exposure, there's just so many moving parts, and this is a really difficult business.
I'm sure. I'm sure it is. And and that leads to my next question. This all sounds great, right? But I'm sure there's a lot of challenges along the way. So talk to us about the difficulties and challenges that you faced as you made this transition. And I'm sure you're probably going through some challenges now.
Yeah, so I think in the early days, the thing that was most difficult for me to conquer, and I would say in those first 6 months is, I went from really understanding what good looks like in medical affairs, right? And knowing my day to day, to suddenly I was leading a function for the organization. And, I was responsible for keeping people on track across the multitude of projects, coordinating those efforts, and then not only coordinating those, but providing regular updates or presentations on the output to our executive leadership team or board of directors. That was a lot. That was a lot for me at first, and you're swimming with the big fish at that point, and I
Yeah,
hadn't done that, and on a regular basis in my career to that point. So there's a certain level of expectation and a certain level of performance that it takes a bit of time to appreciate. But with time, obviously, though, those all overcome. I think my biggest challenge now is, I joke with folks that I'm still friends with in medical affairs, is, when I was an MSL, I could probably keep track of my to-dos on, 4 or 5 post-it notes. I mean, now, over in the corner of my office here, there's a large dry erase board, and it's a disaster. But that's the life you live, and business development, corporate development is not for the faint of heart.
mm,
There's a lot. It's a roller coaster of emotions. You think you're really close on something, and all of a sudden the bottom drops out. But you have to think. Yeah, the motivation, at least for me and most individuals that are in this type of role, is that we feel like we can be transformational in terms of the direction of the company, as
sure.
well as providing innovative therapies to patients that are in need. So that's what keeps us up and going every day. But the transition is not fraught with challenge. And I think early on, it was important for me to identify, I always had advocates in the organization, but identifying those true advocates in my new role, and those that could, if I was drowning, that I knew I could count on to go to the right folks and say, hey, how can we get Steve the resources that he needs to be successful given all that we have going on?
Right. Yeah, no, it's a dynamic role, that's for sure. And I being on this side of the equation as a recruiter, I do know a bit about that role that you're playing, and it should only really be pursued by people that are ready to jump into that side of the equation and that type of thing. It's very customer facing, it's very dynamic, it's a lot of ups and downs. You have to be entrepreneurial, you have to have a really thick skin. So there's a whole skill set, which I'm sure we'll get into, but that comes with that type of job. But before we get into more into that, I want to get back to the medical affairs piece, because I don't want to lose sight of your background in medical affairs and in your experience, because you have a great medical affairs background, vast experience. What are your thoughts when you hear, I just heard this term recently, that there's a glass ceiling in medical affairs? Is that something, how do you respond to that? I literally just heard this. I was like, and I thought that was something I'd like to talk to you about and see what your thoughts were.
It's interesting. So, Tom, my heart tells me no, but I think my mind and my experience would tell me yes. There is to some extent, a glass ceiling in medical affairs. So, I think if you think about it from a top-down approach, right? Look at the construct of a executive leadership team at most publicly traded companies.
Hmm.
There may be one or two individuals that have a scientific background of the 7, 8, or 10 individuals that comprise the executive leadership team. And so I think of a large organization that may have 30 or 40 MSLs. So you're competing amongst one of those 30 or 40 MSLs for all of those promotions, all the way up to what may be a single executive leadership team function that encapsulates medical affairs. Whereas I think if you have the opportunity to broaden your experience and your expertise at some point throughout your career by stepping out of that traditional role and becoming uncomfortable, you can go to any of the other aspects or functions within the organization. It could be finance, it could be business development, it could be commercial, marketing, technical operations, you name it. I think it just by stepping in and getting that experience outside of the regular medical affairs channels, it offers up a lot of opportunities to ascend the ladder in a different way within the organization. So, in my mind, when I think about how do you lift that glass ceiling, I think it's by being diverse and having a skill set that can encompass multiple functions. I think the most successful business development, corporate development people that I know and they're within my network still have a really strong scientific acumen.
Mm.
They have a clinical background, they have some type of scientific background, because the number of individuals at a very high level that can understand, that can blend the scientific acumen with the business acumen with the financial acumen, that overall N is pretty small. And
Mm.
so if you can bring all those skill sets to the table, it's not going to only serve you well in business development or corporate development, but it's also going to serve you well at the executive leadership or C-suite level.
Well, and I think just to kind of unpack what you're saying a little bit when we get back to that glass ceiling, I think really a lot depends on the person, where they're at in their career, what organization or organizations they may have been affiliated with, and what they aspire to be. Some people don't ever want to leave medical affairs. They feel like, hey, I have this scientific background. I know medical. I love medical. And I don't want to make that transition to quote unquote the dark side, let's just say. But then there's people that have other aspirations. So I'll give you an example. Sarah Snyder, who's on my team and is a recruiter on my team, she was an MSL for 20 years, decided she wanted to do something different. And she's been tremendously successful. She's been with me for years. She's decided to make the transition. You are a great example of somebody that said, hey, I want to expand my capabilities, my career outside of medical affairs, jumped over into this M&A role. You're on the commercial side, thriving. You have a great career. There's so much going on. You and I have spoken about, how great of a move it was. So I think it becomes a matter of, what do you want for yourself? Where do you see yourself? And what do you ultimately want to do next? And I know a lot of people have a difficult time answering that question, because I ask that question every day. So I think that's what you have to decide first, and then that'll determine where you might want to go. And then realize there's never, ever, ever a glass ceiling on your career if you're willing to step outside your comfort zone. Do you agree with that?
Totally agree. And I used this term on a podcast that I did recently when I got a similar question. And it was early in my career that I viewed myself as a business mind trapped in a scientist body.
Mm.
And so for a number of years, I thought, how can I escape that? And so, to your point, yes, my goal was to try to step outside of this. And, even throughout all my stops in medical affairs at all the companies that I've been in, I know that I've never been the smartest scientific person in the room, and that was okay with me. I didn't take issue with that, because I was more focused on, building other skills that I thought could one day lead me to, to come outside of my, normal medical affairs role. And when I didn't mention this at the beginning of the talk, but when I first transitioned to industry, I went back to business school simultaneously. And went back and got my MBA. And at the time, a lot of folks asked me, well, what the heck are you doing this for? And, my response was, right now, I don't really know, but I think it will be time that is well invested and will open more doors for me than it will close at some point in my career. And Tom, I was just lucky that those doors opened sooner for me rather than later.
Well, it's great that you had that, something had to have led you there. You must have had this inner desire, whether it was subconscious or conscious, that you knew that you needed to transition into something where it was entrepreneurial, it was more business oriented. So maybe even back then you just knew and I think that that's one of the things that most people need to try to get in tune with is, what is your authentic self? What do you really want to do? How do you want to evolve in your career? And I know that that's a very difficult question, but I think it takes a lot of self-reflection, and maybe a step back. You just said it, you were a business mind in a scientific role, or however you put it, like you knew. So I think that that's one of the things that's important, is that each person has to kind of come to grips in terms with their strengths, capabilities, desires, where they see themselves and where they want to go. And you clearly did that. And you're obviously a success, and you have, and by the way, guys, for those of you who maybe aren't watching this on YouTube, or you haven't, like, Steve's a young guy, like he's got a huge career ahead of him. It's not like he's at the tail end of his career. He's right smack in the sweet spot. So this is a great story. Steve, tell us, for people that may be interested in this type of role in M&A, what skills do you think are most important for people to develop in order to find success in that type of role?
Yeah, so first and foremost, obviously, the business fundamentals, right, is really important to understanding, how a business runs, how cash flows through a business, what are all the puts and takes that you have to think about as you're flowing through a P&L. But I think the other important thing, Tom, is just to be able to develop those working and personal relationships across an entire organization.
Yeah.
That's, to me, I mean, the relationship building and relationship management is most important. A lot of those other finer details within the art of the business, the art of the deal, the art of negotiating, that comes with time and comes with experience. But I think the people skills and just the general foundational business skills are foundational to someone's success in this type of role if they're looking to step outside of a traditional PharmD or MSL career path.
And do you feel that your skills that you developed in medical affairs are ones that you routinely use now in your current role?
Definitely. I think, certainly the scientific acumen, right? If we're thinking about bringing a product into the organization, if the science doesn't make sense, then nothing else matters. We're not going to waste time on commercial assessments, marketing assessments, manufacturing and technology assessments. The science doesn't make sense. So I use that every day, and it really helps me. We may get, say, 50 inbound inquiries a year about folks that are interested in licensing their technology to an organization. I can take those 50 inbound inquiries and pretty quickly decide whether one is worthwhile to bring forward and invest a lot of resource in the organization. So, I think that skill is foundational. The people management, right? At MSL, it can be a lonely life. You can be making a lot of cold calls to MSLs. There's a lot of rejection that we have to deal with, and I think that helps prepare you for the roller coaster that business development and M&A can be.
Would you say that those, what you just mentioned, the scientific side and this background as an MSL, almost makes or could make you a differentiator in that world?
Definitely. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, there are a fixed number of folks, and the number is not large, that are able to connect the dots between science, understanding how technologies work, and then the business and financial side of of industry. And if you can connect all those dots, you're going to be really successful in your career in a role such as, what I'm doing now.
Well, you mentioned something to me interesting. You said that for people that may be interested in transitioning into this type of role, it's important for them to understand the DNA of a company before they make that move. So can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so I think I can section it into two kind of unique things. So if you're an MSL looking for a medical affairs role at a company, but also think that in the future you may want to take on a non-traditional path, you're going to want to look at inside the organization. What have others in the MSL role at that company done? Have they gone on to be contributors in other areas? Have they been afforded opportunities outside of the traditional MSL day to day? So I think, if you're interviewing, that should be a question that you ask the hiring manager, but a question that you also want to hear from the current team members, right? Um, were they promised one thing, and then when they came in and got so busy with a launch or something like that, that those opportunities for non-traditional work were not there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, if you're someone that is looking for a different business development role, I mean, the DNA of a company, right? We have a strategic remit or strategic objectives that are corporate development, business development related. So if that is to bring in additional commercial products, one, does the company have the resources to do that? Do they have the financial resources to do it? Do they have the human resources to do it? M&A is really expensive. We don't go out and buy products for $5 or $10 million usually.
Mm.
So is the capital available to the company to be able to execute upon that? Do they have the infrastructure that can support it? You spent a long time on the commercial side of the business. Does that sales force have the ability to take in another product given where it is in its life cycle? If you're thinking about building a pipeline, again, does the organization have the talent and experience to bring those assets forward through late stage development to commercialization? If they don't have the talent, do they have the ability to go out and acquire it or pay for it? So, those are the things on kind of the financial side that you want to make sure that you're looking at if you're thinking about taking a leap of faith. So it's one thing to, say, I want to grow my business. It's another thing to have the resources at your disposal to actually be able to execute upon that.
Right. Yeah, no, that's good info. And for MSLs that are listening right now, I know you and I talked about, you had made a comment and you said, yeah, people need to be careful because LinkedIn could be your best friend, but it could be your worst enemy at the same time. So explain what you meant by that.
Yeah, so taking a step out of your comfort zone, right, typically does not lead to a near-term promotion. So,
Mm-hmm.
what I could comment on is my transition was very much a lateral move, and
Mm-hmm.
I knew that it was going to require some time and investment before I would be promoted in a new role. And so, the comment that LinkedIn can be your worst friend during that time is, you're looking at all your old colleagues in medical affairs that have, gone on to be, senior or executive MSLs. They've gone on to medical director. They've gone on to, maybe it's leading scientific affairs or medical publications or communications. So you're seeing all these people that used to be your peers around you, and you're watching their promotion and their success within their own career. And at times it can be a little bit defeating and deflating. But in my mind, I always just had to have my eyes on the long term, and I knew that this would be time well spent stepping outside my comfort zone and growing my skill set. And I know that one day, that I'll be able to keep up with all those promotions of folks that I've seen around in the last 5 years, but it's going to take a little more time to get there.
Sure. Yeah. And so for people that may be interested in making this type of transition, either to, some type of role in M&A or business development, what would you say, what advice would you give them as to what would make them attractive? What sorts of things should they be doing to make them a more attractive candidate to make that transition from MSL over to M&A?
Yeah, so I think number one, it's raising your hand, volunteering to get involved in as many projects outside of medical affairs that you can.
Mm-hmm.
developing those cross-functional relationships, getting involved in those working groups is critical. Because, when there's an opening in an organization, similar to my own experience, there's a level of comfort with those senior leaders knowing, oh, geez, I've worked with Steve for, a year on this project. He's, always come forth and, met timelines on deliverables. It's been high quality. And those folks, sometimes would rather promote from within the organization with a known entity and a known commodity rather than bring somebody in externally. So I think that speaks to roles, outside of business development and broader. I think from a BD perspective, if you have the opportunity to get involved in any diligence activities that your company is partaking as they're looking at other assets, again, raise your hand and offer to be involved in those activities. And sometimes it's maybe not even, being a working contributor, but just being a silent observer, understanding how the processes and flows work. And again, the more personal and professional relationships you can develop with folks in other parts of the organization, the higher likelihood that they're going to vouch for you in terms of being able to step outside your comfort zone, come in and contribute in your new role in a meaningful way and in a relatively short time period.
Good stuff, man. Awesome advice. Let's leave it at that. You're the man, Steve. Appreciate you coming on. I learned a lot. I thought this was really insightful. So yeah, man, we'll have to do this again. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tom, for the opportunity. It's been amazing. And I think if I encourage one person today to think about stepping outside of their comfort zone, then I will have accomplished my goal. And for all your listeners, if you have questions about the journey or want some insight, I'm here to guide folks. I think giving back the best I can to the profession is what I love doing. So for anybody out there, feel free to get a hold of me.
Awesome. Appreciate that. Thanks, guys, for listening. Appreciate you all. Love you all. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe so that you don't miss episodes in the future. And feel free to leave a rating or a review or a comment. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.